Hi, my name's Dan, and what we're looking at here is the initial commit for what would become BookStack. As we can see here, the date is July the 12th, 2015, and that means that now BookStack is over 10 years old. That is a decade of BookStack. So that is just absolutely insane. When I first initially made this commit 10 years ago, I didn't have any idea about the user base that this would then have in the future. So just a thank you to everyone that's kind of ever been involved with a project, whether that's contributing code, whether that's supporting issues, providing translation, just being part of the community, or even just like mentioning the project on social media or on Reddit and things like that. Or maybe you created content and videos mentioning BookStack. All of these things has built BookStack to be what it is today and has helped endure and motivate during this last decade. So just, a massive thank you to everyone that's ever touched the project. Now, recently, looking back at this last decade, I realized I think there's quite a lot to be proud of in regards to the project. So on the BookStack blog, I've written a post about the things that I think we can be really proud of over this last decade, and I'll link this in the description of this video. Now in this video, I'm going to go over a few things that we commonly kind of review at these anniversary milestones. And then I'm going to do something which I haven't really done before as part of this sort of decade celebration, which is a little Q&A. So first off, a review of the finances for the project. So this chart is showing the revenue, the overall top level revenue income via our different revenue sources. So we've got Ko-fi donations, our support services, and then GitHub sponsors, which are essentially donations within that. And looking over the past 12 months, things have continued to grow. So we've got a few more spikes in regard to especially the support services. And these are reflecting people purchasing the enterprise support plan, which is priced at $4,500 per year, which obviously contributes quite a boost to these numbers. And then those are mixed in with a bunch of new and renewing professional support plans. So those are the £450 support offerings. And overall, this is representing about a 32% increase in our support service revenue. And then looking at our GitHub sponsors, which are the blue bars, these have also increased year on year and increased even more. So these are up by about 57% in comparison to the 12 months before that, which is probably attributed to a few extra company level sponsorships. So those are the monthly amounts that are around sort of the 100, 250 and £500 a month options. But these are backed up by many other smaller one-off or recurring donations as well. So overall, these have grown to provide just that really stable kind of base of donations coming in. And then we also have Ko-fi, and Ko-fi hasn't really grown in terms of revenue year on year. I think we've only seen about a 5% increase, which is still something, but it appears that just GitHub sponsors is still kind of the preferred option when presented for most people. So looking kind of back over the last 12 months, we're seeing an overall 12-month revenue of about £53,000, and that's pretty much what I was making as a technical development lead in my kind of professional work before I left my old job to pursue BookStack full time. And that's just kind of incredible to me that I can be coming up to the same amount of money on open source work alone. That's amazing. Thinking that I left my job was the end of 21. So within about a 4-year time frame, these revenue sources have been able to build up to be around the same amounts. So just once again, a completely massive thanks to everyone that has ever supported by any of these revenue means. It just seems absolutely insane that I'm able to get that stable income that's now quite a significant amount. So just a big thank you. And if you're interested in learning more about donations within open source generally, but specifically within BookStack, on my other channel, Down on Open Source, I've created this donations and sponsorship guide. It's really meant for other maintainers that are thinking about taking on sponsorships, but it goes through BookStack as an example of how I've got things set up and how the breakdown of donations look. So for example, the bit that I'm currently paused on is reflecting a breakdown of all donations provided throughout 2024. But if you're interested, I'll link to that within the description of this video. And then one last thing in regards to the finances. So in our 9 years of BookStack blog post last year, I mentioned about wanting to increase the sponsorships that I was forwarding on. So I was currently forwarding on about maybe £100 per month in terms of donations to the projects that we depend upon. And throughout the past year, I've over doubled that to about £225. And that's not including a lot of the larger one-off donations to people that don't accept sponsorships via GitHub sponsors. But I want to ramp this up even further, especially looking at the success in finances over the last year. So I'll probably look to increase the sponsorships that we're already providing, because I did go through this year and try and make sure that we're getting as many projects as possible to cover our dependencies. But yeah, I think over this year, I really want to bump a lot of these up a lot higher to make sure a lot of these people that we rely upon are somewhat covered, at least by our usage. And now onto some of the statistics of BookStack. So you'll be able to find these full figures within the Decade of BookStack blog post, again, linked in the description. But I won't dive into them in this video, but I'm just going to go over some of my thoughts and key findings from the figures over the last year. So something that stuck out to me was the increase in visitors to our website. So comparing the last 12 months to the period before, we're seeing about a 20% increase across unique visitors and total visits. And I found this interesting because I've done so little marketing within the last year. I was thinking about doing more, but I just really didn't do anything. So it's quite pleasing to see this sort of natural 20% growth, which is kind of reassuring because it kind of shows I don't need to stress about the marketing aspect. I can keep focus on the project itself rather than having to focus on other things like marketing, which I'm really not good at and probably wouldn't want to do. And then we're also 22 followers down on Twitter, or X nowadays, which is kind of to be expected really, because as of January 30th, I stopped posting any updates onto Twitter, and it was a while before that I think that I removed the links from the website so nobody could kind of follow through to find our Twitter page. So yeah, not surprising in that aspect, but it's interesting to see the follower count slowly drop. But in its place, I have seen an increase in our Mastodon following, which is now up to 844 followers, which is a lot more than we've ever had on Twitter or X, which I think is pretty awesome, especially as you can think of Mastodon and the Fediverse as kind of, tech niche. But I think it's quite well aligned to our audience, which means we get a bit of a following, and we also get a good bit of interaction here as well. It's not just followers, it's not just dead accounts. You do get a good amount of boosts, favorites, and comments here and there. So overall, I'm quite enjoying this change, and it's worked out quite well. And then more specific to the project itself, there has been fewer releases. I think this was around 22 last year, but the number of commits per year has grown, which I think makes sense overall, because we're becoming an older, more mature, more stable platform. There's generally going to be less releases going out, but there's still quite a lot of work going on regardless. But it's just going to be kind of more maintenance work, more tweaking, more refinement, just not as many things that we can package into releases of their own, really. Just to be expected, but quite interesting to see in the numbers. Alright, so now on to the Q&A portion of this video. So Klassinger on our BookStack subreddit has asked, what originally inspired you to create BookStack? Was there a specific problem or need that you encountered that led you to start developing a documentation app? So I guess it kind of originated from this slideshow. So for context, at my old job, which was my first kind of proper tech job, within about 6 months of me joining, a lot of people were leaving, and there was kind of a lot of general unhappiness within the team because of a lot of the process that was put in place and a lot of kind of the struggles in the day-to-day work. So quite boldly, me and a couple of other colleagues that were still left put together a presentation, unprompted, about essentially what we called it tech team improvement ideas, but it's exactly what needs to change within the team to make it where we can enjoy being at work. And in this, we just laid out a few things that we believe, just needed a change within the process of our work. And there was key specific topics within this. For example, we've got one here, improve testing. We could have like a little proper testing workstation, and that never really panned out. But one of them was better documentation, with the reasoning being that our documentation was all in different locations, and Rich, our manager, was an absolute quality chap. He was creating a lot of documentation for our team, but it was all over the place. It was difficult to find, and we had stuff in Dropbox, and then some stuff would be in like Gist box, I think it was called. Then some people would have their own personal bit of documentation. It was just kind of everywhere, really. So the idea was, how can we get this into one place that we can actually, make use of this content? But in here, we've even written, Atlassian Confluence or something like it, just because that seemed to be, a platform along the right kind of lines for what we needed. So each of us presenting this presentation, we each took away one of these key items after showing it to kind of work on, refine further, and explore options. And the documentation aspect wasn't mine. I think I was looking into building out this testing workstation, but it intrigued me that there wasn't something well suited already open source. There were still open source options. For example, I think DocoWiki was the main contender in mind, which is still going, is still a fantastic platform, but it just didn't look suited to kind of the usage that I had in mind, where we could have like a cross-company platform that could be used by everyone, no matter their kind of technical expertise. It looked like we might be able to build it in a way that was then usable. Like I remember it didn't come with like a WYSIWYG editor by default, but there was like an add-on for that. But having no experience with the software, I didn't know, how official those add-ons would be. Are they officially provided? Are they updated in line with the software itself? And it looked like we might need to like piece a lot of different add-ons together to get it to where we needed. And I just wasn't confident about how that would turn out overall. Because if it wasn't made for a kind of use case out of the box, will it be further friction going down the road? And something like Confluence was an option, but of course that comes with a cost. I think it might have been a fairly low cost. I seem to remember something like $5 per user per month, which in terms of business isn't bad. But to me, I hated that idea of per user pricing when it comes to documentation. It should be frictionless. I really didn't want a scenario whether we'd have to, find workarounds or export content and send it to other teams, or just be wary of how many people we're providing access to our core documentation because of per user pricing. I didn't want to have to go to ask finance to get people onboarded on our documentation platform. That just felt stupid. So in the end, it just got me thinking that there seems to be this space out there for a documentation platform that's kind of not so technically wiki focused, but is ready to go, kind of user friendly, focuses on user experience, and is kind of batteries included. You don't need to have a whole bunch of add-ons. It's just ready to go, easy to maintain, and is stable. So I thought it couldn't be that difficult to build. It's just a WYSIWYG editor and a database. I had some familiarity with building apps at this time, and especially with WYSIWYG editors. So I thought it should be quite an easy task. But yeah, here we are a decade later, still working on this WYSIWYG editor that's attached to a database. So another question from Klassinger, and here I've merged quite a few of their questions because they're all very much related. How did you come up with the name BookStack? It fits the concept very well, but I'm curious if there's a particular story behind it. Were there other content models or structures you considered before setting on the current one? I'd love to hear more about your design process and the evolution of the idea. What led you to design the content structure around shelves, books, chapters, and pages? If it was very unique and intuitive, or was this model inspired by real-world libraries or something else? So for this, I'm going to refer back to my A Year of BookStack blog post, where I look over the initial moments of progress and the design evolution. So initially, just playing with the mechanics of it, it was called Oxbow, kind of a play on Confluence, both features of a river. But you can see here, I originally started off with having books, because I do think that it's useful to have those kind of real world analogies. Again, going back to what I said earlier about my purpose of this, I was trying to make this user friendly, so I think it helps to have that kind of skeuomorphism, even if it's only a name, to help people understand what abstract concepts are relative to real world things. So yeah, books were in there for an early stage, and as we look forward, this goes to then books and pages. You can see the design's slightly refined here, and as we continue further, we can see again the design's changing. What you might notice here is that we've got sub pages, and then sub pages, and then sub pages. So yeah, at this stage, thinking from a technically minded view that infinite is best to have. You don't want to be limited by things. So I just had the books as the main containers, and then within those you can just have pages that can then contain other pages, and then just however many as you need. And then, as you can see here, this is when it actually became BookStack. So it's still within that first month of development that it becomes BookStack. I'm not sure exactly how I got the name, but I'm pretty confident it's based on already having books within the platform, and then Stack being quite an obvious thing to add on to that. Thinking about things like Stack Exchange and Stack Overflow, and by itself being a word, I was quite amazed that this wasn't already used by a popular bit of software. So I felt quite fortunate to find that name, because naming's never easy. This kind of worked out. But yeah, still no chapters or anything, but it's just books, pages, and now it's BookStack. And now with a further month of refinement, again, the design has evolved quite a lot more. It's still quite different to what we see as BookStack, but you can see here within the sidebar, that's looking quite familiar now. Now comes the book, the chapter, and the page layout, which I remember thinking that works really well in regards to the name. It's really kind of doubling down on that analogy and connecting things to real world items, and BookStack itself is kind of skeuomorphic. And it's really this sidebar was one of the core things to making that decision to limit that from that infinite page depth to this tiered structure. Because if we go back up here to the one where we do have the infinite depth, it's not very clear in terms of the hierarchy. I mean, there would be some ways to improve on this with just some indenting or whatever, but it was when I was really thinking about that UX and who I was intending to build the platform for, is when things changed. Because when you have an infinite depth, although that's technically better in terms of you have infinite possibilities there, that does come with a trade-off. Is when you have that kind of depth, it's easy for things to get lost. It makes discovery a lot more difficult. It makes designing a user interface much more difficult. Like again, thinking back to that sidebar, if you have an infinite depth, even with indenting, at some point that quickly becomes problematic. You have to have limits within the UI. I don't think it's conceptually very easy to understand a deep tree. And this is especially important when you think about the scenario that we're coming from, where we have a whole bunch of different storage options and often with a whole bunch of different files strewn across a file system across Dropbox. I didn't want to end up in the same place just on an online platform. So I found by restricting things just to this tiered platform where all content was in pages, then you could have chapters to group things up, and then you have pages as your kind of defined areas of documentation. I just think it helps standardize and fix in that structure to create some predictability and understandability. You're only ever 3 layers of depth away from where you might need to be. So yeah, I just thought that's really important, and that's remained, the core idea of BookStack to now. As we go across another couple of months, that's where I've kind of refined the design, and now this is looking very familiar. A few odd things like the book navigations on the other side, and we have the kind of this bar. We're missing a lot of things that have been added to BookStack since. But I mean, this is pretty much like 90% of what people use of BookStack right here. If you haven't been a long-term user of BookStack, you may notice that shelves aren't part of this because they weren't part of the original releases of BookStack. It was only a while after that people started requesting another layer. And of course, this is something that I'm quite hesitant of because of all the reasons that I just stated. I thought that hierarchy is quite important. Having a fixed number of layers is quite important. But a lot of people are asking, do you just need one more layer? Which is something that I can understand. But I also think if I add that, then it's just going to cause more people asking for just one more layer to suit other use cases. And I don't think it is something that's essential. If you think about Wikipedia, that's all I know there's other organization options there, but this is all essentially like one layer. So I don't think it's essential, but it is certainly a tool. But, despite that, I did kind of give in, but only partially. So I added shelves, but one of the main things was that they're going to be kind of distinct because it made implementation a bit easier if they don't have to be another core item in the hierarchy. But I thought, we'll give them their own unique ability, so it's just not another simple item in the hierarchy. So shelves came in with the ability to have books be part of multiple shelves, which isn't the same with chapters and pages where they belong to a chapter or book. And I think that appeased people, but of course it wasn't long before people were asking for one more layer. And looking back on shelves, I think they made sense in the context of the time, but in the long-term nature of the project, they probably caused more trouble by this point. Because from a new user's perspective, I think they're a bit too confusing because they're presented there, but they don't act the same as the other items, and they look like an item within the hierarchy in a lot of places, but you don't have things like permission inheritance because of how they work. So recently I've been thinking a bit deeper about how that might look in the future, and what my current thinking is now. Again, there's a lot of work to go before this, but I'd probably, double down on shelves being something unique and make them kind of greater collections of things. So maybe you add other content types. Any item within the hierarchy could be added to a shelf. It can be a unique collection of different types of items, which kind of overlaps with tags. So I'm going to have to think about how that interacts. But then in place of shelves, we add a new default higher level item within the hierarchy. Maybe we rename shelves or something else and reuse the shelves name. So something that sits above books that does act the same to kind of replace a lot of the trouble that people have with shelves. And now a question from Kism, again on our BookStack subreddit. How long did it take you to go from idea to publishing the first version and letting users try it? So again, the idea was really born out of this presentation, and that would have been early 2015. I don't know the exact date, but looking at the metadata for this presentation, it is showing a date of about May 2015, which seems about right. So it would have been maybe a couple of months of the idea slowly building up in my head, and kind of, I guess, the motivation also to start building something. And then going back to this blog post, we see the development going on here. And I think it's while it was in this form that I first presented it to my workplace as a solution to the problem to implement it, because essentially it wasn't up to me whether this would get implemented. I was pretty much, the lowest level employee there was at the company. But I demoed it in this form to kind of show the idea of it, the purpose of it, and the fact that I could get something, working that would suit our use case. And the feedback was positive, I remember that at the time. But it was a bit later when we first started using it within the company. And I have in mind, it would have been quite towards the end of the year. So I was going to say kind of November or December in 2015 that we actually set up the instance and started putting stuff in there. And that instance would remain the oldest BookStack instance to ever exist. And based on the last intel that I had, which was maybe a year old at this point, it was still running. And then it was a few months later after that, so at the very start of, January the 1st, 2016, that I then shared this on the self-hosted subreddit, which was when things kind of really kicked off. So overall, we're looking at about like a 6-month period from start of development to sharing it to a wider user audience. And another one from Kism: how do you decide what features to add versus what to reject to maintain BookStack's core philosophy of simplicity? Have there been any features you really wanted to build but ultimately decided against because they would compromise the user experience? So on the BookStack website, I have written up an FAQ which does go over some of these points of feature development, but generally thinking the process is thinking about, does this feature provide enough value to the existing user base relative to its impact to maintenance and support? And that's really what it comes to. It's focusing on our existing user base, because initially, after launching, this really wasn't the case. You'll just be taking on feature requests left and right, because that's generally more exciting, to expand out the platform, to make it wider, to suit more people, to reach a wider audience. But that's much more difficult to balance long term when you're trying to think about sustainability and maintainability. You can't build something that's going to suit everyone. Because if you think about what I showed earlier about the hierarchy, having an infinite depth hierarchy may be requested by some people, but then the fixed system is going to work better for the use case that I built BookStack for. That is at the core of the platform. So you can't really have both. They kind of conflict with each other. So I always instead try and think about, what best suits our use case and our intended purpose of BookStack, thinking back to that use case of a mixed skill technical audience. What works best for them, because that has been our path of what has led to BookStack being what it is so far, and that is what has built up our user base and audience. So that's who we focus on serving, and that's something that I've found to be really important, is to be really comfortable with not serving an audience and user base that we don't already serve. I'm not going to feel guilty for not making this platform suit the needs of someone that it hasn't been built for, because doing that does mean compromise on our existing audience. So yeah, that's really the core of it. Does it suit our existing audience? In regards to things that I've wanted to build, I've also take a step back and think about what BookStack would be if I was building it for me personally, especially my use case now where, I'm not at that workplace and I'm not in the same kind of team structure. It would look quite different if I was building it from scratch for me. It would be more technically focused. It probably wouldn't have a WYSIWYG editor, but probably a different form of the existing Markdown editor that's in there. And it would maybe be more like notes focused as well and more code focused. But ultimately, that main existing core audience is always my focus with BookStack. And I don't really need those enough to, sneak those into BookStack or change what it is, or to, create a fork or build another little app. So there's nothing that I've been super desiring of, but I have rejected a lot of other people's desires because I would believe it would compromise the user experience of our existing audience. And the last one from Kism: looking back at your choice to build BookStack on PHP Laravel when many similar projects were moving to JavaScript stacks, do you still think that was the right call? What would you tell someone starting a similar project today about technology choices versus long-term maintainability? So yeah, I think PHP Laravel was the right choice, just because, looking back, it's still maintained, it's still stable, it's still a great platform. PHP has evolved to be an even better language. I know a lot of people do not like it, but I do enjoy the kind of how it's evolved, and I enjoy its balance of structure and its typing that isn't too strict. Yeah, I think that's worked out quite well, especially, thinking back, you didn't know if Laravel would be still maintained, 10 years down the line, and it still is, and it's still working out pretty well. There are some things, like they're recently diving into VC funding, which is making me a bit nervous. But ultimately, I just have to look on the value they are providing, which has been 10 years worth of great work. The part about moving to JavaScript stacks is quite interesting, because in 2015 that might have been the case, but I don't think there was a massive amount of momentum there. I remember being quite nervous about doubling down on PHP because Ruby was the really popular choice. Ruby and Ruby on Rails. Looking at those two, Ruby's fallen way more than PHP and Laravel has. So it's quite interesting to see how things change. And I must admit, at this time, I wasn't too deep into the JavaScript world. I'd say my JavaScript, especially anything like Node.js, would have been quite limited. I became much more comfortable with the Node.js stack later on in my work. Ended up building quite a few enterprise applications at my old job using Node.js quite a lot of the time or PHP and Laravel. It ultimately depended on the type of app that we were building. And overall, I probably prefer like JavaScript as a language, at least in terms of its like core library and core functions. But I've always had trouble scaling things up with JavaScript. It's just, that bit too flexible. There's too many differences in patterns. You're trying to build a framework. It always seemed a bit more piecemeal with JavaScript. Whereas the PHP Laravel stack, I really quite enjoyed its monolithic nature and its stability. And then you have things in the PHP world like the PSRs that standardize a lot of things. It's just that kind of general thinking within the PHP landscape that works better for me. Where the JavaScript is more exciting. It's moving a lot faster and is bigger than ever today. But I don't think those alone are things to seek out from a platform. There are some cases where the technology does hold us back a little bit. So with PHP and Laravel, it's difficult to do stuff like web sockets, a lot of the real-time stuff, which is very easy to do comparatively with a JavaScript-based application. And it is possible to do with PHP and Laravel stacks now more than ever. But in the context of providing something like BookStack, where it's not just you providing a SaaS service. You haven't got one single thing that you're fully in control of. You have to think about how easy it is for everyone else to set up, the technologies that they might be able to use, and the different platforms where it may be run. That does make things a little bit harder, thinking about things like trying to add live collaboration. But there's still options there. It's not impossible. But yeah, looking back, I think we made the right call. It's very easy to see issues looking back and to take the benefits for granted. So I do have to say, we've had 10 years of great, stable, continuous progress through the PHP and Laravel stack, which I'm very happy with. In terms of advice to someone starting a similar project today, I'd say that I typically see, especially newer developers, they focus on the wrong things. You see questions on Reddit like, oh, should I be using a different stack because that's showing it's got, 10% more performance, and performance is really important for my application, when really it doesn't matter. Most things are going to be fast enough nowadays. Or they're chasing hype and chasing what's popular. And that does help in some things. I guess especially with LLMs today, if you're relying on those to build out applications, then using what's popular does help. And it does mean there's going to be more guidance and things out there. But I wouldn't focus on, performance and hype and trying to guess these things to dictate your choice in technology. Like even if I chosen Ruby and Ruby on Rails back then, it's still going, it's still supported. And I think we still could have made do, it still would have been fine. What I think is the most important thing really is to choose what you enjoy. These aspects of performance or hype of your choice of technology aren't things that kill most projects. What kills most projects is motivation, is your enthusiasm to keep on going, to build something, to keep on maintaining something. So my advice would be, choose what suits you and your purpose. Choose what you enjoy. Maybe you enjoy going after the hype, keeping on top of things. Fair enough, but don't specifically chase that if that's not what you enjoy. Experiment with different languages. Find what works for you. Find what you like to write with, because that will help your motivation. That will help you keep going. That will increase the chances way more than any other factor that you'll actually get something out the door. And now a question from Sir Ginger on Discord. When are we getting document collaboration features? Smiley face. I don't know whether this is a bit of a joke because it's something that gets asked quite a lot, but I'll answer it regardless. So the answer is, I don't know, and I'm not going to promise any times. But every so often I go through some of the bigger features. And there's like 3 big features that kind of interplay with each other and kind of conflict and make each other feature more difficult. Live collaboration is one of them, and then multilingual page content is another, and a review or workflow process is the last. And these all kind of play in that same kind of page editing area. And every so often I'll go through these and kind of assess viability relative to need. And this is something that I did earlier in the year, and live collaboration was part of that. And I did start going down a road in terms of building out the required libraries and things, because coming back to that question before about technologies, a lot of those things aren't in place for the PHP. That is one area, again, because the technology isn't so suited for it. There isn't as many libraries out there. So I did start going down a particular road, but as I was walking down that road, it was getting a lot bigger than I'd hoped for, at least at that time. So I kind of got burnt out on that. But I do see possibilities for live collaboration. I just don't know exactly when I'm going to return to that for moving that forward. We have technically moved that forward in some ways over the past year or so, as we've built out the new WYSIWYG editor to replace the existing default WYSIWYG editor. The new one is built on a much stricter underlying data structure. Instead of just being the HTML that you get out for the page content, is based on like a JSON typed data structure. And this was a purposeful choice for working towards live collaboration, because it means we have more control and options to diff, to merge and compare and to distribute this data structure for that editor. So we have moved forward in regards to that front end editor, but there's still quite a lot to do. There's a lot to consider. And then our last question comes from Hortus Fox via Mastodon. And Hortus Fox is also an open source project maintained by another Daniel. And that is a plant-based management app. So you can go on there, add your plants, add their details, and help maintain your plants, essentially. So if you're really into plants or you just need help maintaining them, I would really recommend checking out Hortus Fox. So anyway, their question is, would you say that working full-time for BookStack is also a massive benefit to your mental health as opposed to being trapped in a corporate environment as an employee? I'm very curious because in my opinion, working on an open source software while being able to sustain your life looks like a tremendous fortune without all the capitalist pressure. So yeah, I would say it's definitely a privilege for sure. I feel amazingly privileged that I'm able to now sustain and get a good wage from working on open source software full time. But in terms of your benefit to mental health, I'd say there's pluses and minuses. It's going to massively depend on your context, your scenario, who you are, what your project looks like, how you work. Because for me, the way that I've gone about it as well, specifically in terms of how I set up the support and what I do earn my revenue from, it has afforded me a massive amount of freedom. I'm not beholden to anyone. I can pretty much do whatever I want when I want. So I can just, pop out to the shops whenever I want. I have no fixed times where I'm working. I can just go and play video games if I want to. That is a really nice level of freedom. It's always kind of annoyed me how strict the working time range is and how large that working time range is as well. And even if I'm struggling one day, like I sometimes do, I have a form of arthritis that sometimes makes some days quite difficult. I'm under no pressure to continue working. I can just sit and watch movies for that day without feeling guilty, without having to take a sick day. And that is really nice, and that does kind of help your mental health. And then of course the work is a lot nice. I'm focused on things that I enjoy. I enjoy working on BookStack. I enjoy working with the community. Whereas at my prior job, in my tech lead role, I was finding that I was hardly ever, even involved with code. Even managing my small team, my team members were kind of taken away from me to work on things they deemed more important. I was spending most of my days writing up Word documents, working on processes, joining client calls to talk to customers. There was just so much stuff that I didn't enjoy on a day-to-day basis. But then to flip things around a bit, I was working in a workplace with many others, and I did enjoy kind of that social aspect. I'm not a very social person in general, so a lot of my social need was provided by work, and I really enjoyed working with the other technical people around me, and especially working with newer developers, being able to upskill them on technologies, showing them what they could achieve with code. I massively missed that part of things, and I'll say now I probably spend way too much time on Reddit, trying to fulfill some of those same needs, and it just isn't the same. And I should note another thing that I think why this has maybe worked well for me in particular is that I haven't been too stressed out about money. So I don't have a family to provide for, I just have a cat. So my living costs have always been quite low. It was during my last job that I put myself into a stable position where I bought my own flat, on a kind of stable mortgage. I don't go on holidays that often. I don't have that many expenses personally. So I'm in quite a comfortable, stable financial position. So that was true going into working on BookStack full time. So my pressures in terms of making money were quite low. I had a good amount of savings as well. My parents were supporting me for that initial 6-month period. And even though I was losing money for maybe 18 months beyond that, it wasn't too much. The gap was closing and I was in a comfortable position throughout. And now I'm, it's working out really well for me. So yeah, I think that could have been very different if I didn't have stable finances, or if I did have a family relying on me. Then I think that could have easily be a much more mentally difficult scenario relative to making a kind of stable, safe, healthy income at my previous job. So yeah, ultimately it's just something you'd have to assess for yourself, trying to be realistic about the potential implications. Because when going to work on it full time, I was prepared that it wasn't going to work out, that I was going to have to jump ship. I'll have to find another job after 6 months or 12 months. And that's still somewhat the case as well. I'm building my life on open source work, and at any point this project could be taken by someone with a lot more resources than me. A big company could come along and fully rightfully, and I accept that under the open source license, take that away, develop it much faster, make it much better. And that could, I don't know how likely it is, but it could, completely sweep out my donation base, my support payment base. I could be left with something that I can't survive on. So yeah, ultimately it's just about assessing it for yourself, trying to be realistic about the potential scenarios, whether there'd be more of an impact on your mental health for you. But that's the end of the Q&A, and that's everything that I've got for this 10-year update. So let me know if you like the Q&A portion. I'd be interested to see whether this is something I should do a bit more often. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and thanks for being part of this 10-year journey of BookStack.